Thank you for inviting me to be part of this fantastic forum on clinical science training. I'm June Gruber from the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'll be speaking with you today on clinical science research mentoring. We know that the growth of our field vitally depends on the work of engaged mentors nurturing future generations of clinical scientists. The goal of my talk today is to share insights from collective discussions emerging in our field around conceptualizations of what research mentoring is, key issues that apply when mentoring students at different training and career phases, and considerations of ways to assess and advance best practices in clinical science mentoring as a field. I'll walk through the following 3 points on our roadmap today towards this end. First, discussing what is research mentoring. Second, what do we know about research mentoring? In other words, what is its current evidence base? And third, what can we do to understand and advance a path forward for best practices in clinical science mentorship? Importantly, today I'll focus specifically on the research aspect of mentoring, and that's defined in particular as how to best train future scientists in conducting and disseminating research about psychopathology and its assessment and treatment. So with that, let's begin with tackling the daunting question of what is mentoring. The ideas I'll share with you today have emerged from collaborative and collective discussions with an array of psychological scientists in our field. This includes a phenomenal team of clinical scientists you see here from across the country, where we've engaged together in collective efforts to begin to address how research mentoring issues uniquely impact and are instantiated within clinical science training programs. And through this collective conversation, we discovered fascinating and perhaps daunting historical roots of where the concept of mentor came from. So the very concept of a mentor has daunting literary origins in Homer's Odyssey. As some of you may remember, Telemachus was left behind as his father journeys to Troy, and in so he was tasked with governing Ithaca and juggling a throng of menacing suitors who seemed eager to marry his mother. He struggled with this task, at times feeling addled and inept to perform the very task at hand. That is, until the goddess Athena intervenes and assumed the body and voice of Mentor, an old friend of his father, who provided transformative guidance, encouraging Telemachus to approach the task at hand, and even providing him with a seeming transformative degree of psychological fortitude. So what do we learn from this story about mentoring? Well, it seems what we learn about mentoring from this story are at least 3 things. First, that a mentor should literally be godlike, possessing human proportions or proportions beyond being merely human, and in fact be worshipped. Second, a mentor should also be an all-knowing sage or guru, potentially with a following. And third, that a mentor should somehow instantiate epic change or transformation within the mentee. Now, for contemporary clinical scientists, these expectations may be familiar but are quite formidable, especially in the modern era where few faculty are formally taught mentorship skills and are often in search of guidance and support. So, from this rather daunting conceptualization of what a mentor ought to be, what do we know currently about what mentoring actually is and what are its effective ingredients? So, in other words, what do we know about mentoring? Well, there are at least 4 consistent findings that have been reasonably well established by research mentoring in general. First, we know that effective mentoring involves providing mentees with multiple types of support. This includes not only research advising, but also promoting their career, serving as a role model, protecting, accepting, providing psychosocial support, and even at times counseling and befriending. So it's a really multiple-prong approach that seems to support the most effective type of mentoring. Second, we also know that there are certain qualities in a mentor that can enhance mentoring effectiveness. In particular, Rose and colleagues outline 3 broad dimensions of individual differences in a priori ratings of the, quote, ideal mentor. These include integrity, so defined as valuing and believing in the mentee, giving them proper credit, and being thoughtful and considerate; guidance, or providing information, setting deadlines, and helping them problem solve; and even the relationship quality itself, having a positive attitude, informal interactions, and even sharing personal experiences. Third, we also know that there's qualities of the mentee themselves that also enhance mentoring and the effectiveness of mentoring relationships. Mentee behaviors include arriving on time, being prepared for meetings, taking responsibility for one's own actions, and also exhibiting traits of gratitude and humility. And we know as well that multiple mentor models have many benefits. So a multiple mentor model is defined as a constellation of supportive relationships or a developmental network that can support mentees in different domains and across their evolution as scientists. And this yields clear benefits. This includes providing the mentee with diverse perspectives, different knowledge and skill sets, providing more collective time towards mentoring the trainee, and buffering against potentially problematic mentoring dynamics with one or more mentors. So we know that there's some things about mentoring that appear to promote or enhance effective mentoring. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's outlining some key ingredients. However, this becomes complex because we know that mentoring isn't simply one domain with one type of mentor or one type of mentee. And in fact, we know that there's considerable complexity underlying factors that predict effective mentoring outcomes, and that these inevitably involve unique considerations for mentoring across various career stages. This includes mentoring students ranging from undergraduates through graduate programs, interns and postdoctoral fellows, through early career faculty and beyond. And if this wasn't complex enough, we also know within each of these different career stages that mentoring tasks usually involve at least 4 separate domains, including professional development, personal development, emotional or psychosocial support, and skill building. What this leaves us is with a dizzying array of at least 16 distinct cells of mentoring tasks, goals, and domains to develop competency in for the mentor and ensure it's relevant to the individual mentee for their career success. So take the first role, professional development, just as one example. When we look across different career phases, we see there are important and unique milestones. So at the undergraduate level, this can involve exposing them to the field in its current theories, reviewing the state-of-the-art literature, learning how to develop hypotheses, and cultivating curiosity. As we segue into graduate or doctoral students, there can be an increased focus on gaining depth in a specific research area, fostering and promoting intellectual independence, and also helping establish important and central networks and learning how to network professionally. When we segue to post-dissertation, either clinical interns or postdoctoral fellows, there's a key focus on ways to promote autonomy in one or more areas of research and or clinical competence. This might involve solidifying their research program, establishing key career goals, as well as finding ways to facilitate supervision skills and ensure they have access to data sets or collaborators that will allow them to access a key and successful faculty or other position and transition through the first 3 years of a faculty career. So finally, when we think about early faculty, we know that there are many complex and simultaneous goals, but these can often focus in terms of professional development on fostering career opportunities, achieving pre-tenure benchmarks, and helping support financial autonomy in the form of successful attainment of grants and navigating grant mechanisms. And these are simply one row, and these are simply key examples. So we know that it's a complex and complicated task to really establish key mentoring milestones by career stage, all the more complex when we consider that within clinical science we're often balancing what seem to be competing rather than synergistic professional goals relating to pedagogy, scholarly research, clinical training, and service. So we know that there are key ingredients to establish effective research mentoring, and we have just seen how this can be very complex and must be considered carefully throughout different stages of the trainee's career and across different domains of development, from professional development to personal development to emotional or psychosocial support and concrete skill building. At the same time, what we know about mentoring at a general level is seemingly at odds with how mentoring is commonly depicted in mainstream scientific communities, sometimes within graduate cohorts, and in society at large. For example, mentoring is often depicted as something ominous or absent, perhaps having some benign neglect, and that mentoring relationships, especially at the graduate level, are long-term but often fraught with conflict that can even end on grave terms, right? This is from PhD Comics for those of you who aren't familiar, likening graduate school and a kind of a connection with the mentor as something that is long-term but can, entered with naivete, ending in, bitter remorse, and often leading an individual to view mentoring as anything less than an ideal and supportive experience. So this really then begs the question of what can we do as a field? In other words, how can we chart ideas for a path forward for further study and implementation in the clinical science mentorship? So here what I'd like to do is widen the lens or aperture to pose several bigger picture questions or puzzles that our field of clinical science and psychological science at large needs to be poised to grapple with. The first puzzle is really the question of what do we strive to achieve in good mentoring? What are our goals in mentoring? Is it scaffolding the development of students into academic careers, or the dissemination of empirically supported treatments out in the real world? Is it focusing on enhancing happiness during the mentoring period? And how can we prioritize among what seem to be at times quite distinct trajectories or outcomes? So while we think about how to balance among these different outcomes and goals, what I'd like to suggest are a couple specific, concrete, and actionable items that we can initiate now to begin to gain traction towards improving mentoring practices looking forward. The first is really enhancing transparency in mentoring, focusing on enhancing transparency of expectations for our students and mentees. This is work that's emerged among conversations with my colleagues and graduate students at my home institution at the University of Colorado Boulder, and a specific focus here in our conversations has centered on the critical importance of providing clear, agreed upon, and written expectations within research labs to improve mentoring of students and trainees. Such agreements, which we call written lab agreements, would focus on the responsibilities of the mentor and the trainee, focusing on it as a literal two-way street, on facilitating communication, and on achieving and discussing mutual expectations, including availability, contributions to the lab, relevant tasks, and meeting frequency. And there's really three benefits to these kinds of written agreements. They enhance transparent communication, they foster trust and mutual accountability, and they increase clear goal setting and productivity. And by lab agreements, really what we're referring to are ways to develop clear expectations in writing. These can include written notes on group culture and norms, work schedule. Do you expect your trainees to be in the lab every day from 9 to 5, or do you have a different vision for what your lab should look like? What are appropriate lab tasks for undergraduates versus thesis students, grad students, postdocs, and the like? What is the mode and frequency of communication? And they should outline clear and realistic goals. These can be done across levels. These can be implemented on a one-to-one basis between each mentor and mentee within a lab research group, and can be established within a research group or unit, meaning within clinical science programs or the department as a whole. Importantly, any kinds of written agreements should be dynamic and can change and should change over time as the culture of the lab grows, expands, and improves. And importantly, within the kind of organization of typical research institutions, we must find ways to recognize faculty for their efforts in creating and using written agreements because, as we've seen, this idea that outlining clear expectations is gaining greater traction within our field as a whole, suggesting even that the key to a happy lab life lies in clearly delineated and often written sets of expectations and norms. So, enhancing transparency is critical. A second goal that I would suggest we consider as a field are finding ways to devote efforts towards expanding our scope of mentoring activities to broaden the accessibility and dissemination of resources on mentoring, providing them freely, openly, and to all trainees. Towards this end, my colleagues Leah Somerville, Neil Lewis Jr., Jay Van Bavel, and William Cunningham and I have developed and launched in the past year a monthly column in Science Careers really focused on professional development for young scientists. It's called Letters to Young Scientists and includes topics ranging from preparing research talks, interviewing for graduate school, and finding work-life balance, among others. A closely connected puzzle to how do we establish clear and tractionable goals for mentoring is how do we measure mentoring. So once we decide what our goals are, how do we identify measurable outcomes for evaluating the effectiveness of mentoring? This work's really going to depend on our devising and operationalizing reliable and valid measures of mentoring, career outcomes, and mentee and mentor satisfaction, collecting and pooling comparable data across different training programs, and really leveraging the very skill set that we have as clinical scientists by using appropriate experimental or quasi-experimental designs to test critical mentoring questions. A third puzzle is really thinking about how many mentors is the just right amount. So we began this talk with reference to the myth of Odysseus, in which mentoring falls within the hands of a single guru or mentor figure, the goddess Athena. Unfortunately, in many ways, this godlike vision of a mentor carries through to today, and in many ways carries over to decisions and typical models of mentoring. So students often apply to work with typically a single mentor who oversees their training and professional development, provides emotional support, and typically is held responsible for their success as well as their failure. Yet everyday experience suggests a radically different reality than this single guru approach. We know that mentoring is in fact an endeavor of villages rather than individuals, and that students typically receive mentoring from a variety of sources in addition to their primary research mentor on paper, including their course instructors, clinical supervisors, director of clinical training, as well as other clinical and non-clinical faculty. And indeed, the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity provides a mentor map, which can be accessed at the website link at the bottom right, facultydiversity.org, that really illustrates the various functions that mentors can provide. In many ways, this allows trainees to begin to conceptualize mentoring as not as a single guru model of mentoring, but more appropriately as a village model, as well as help them concretely map out different nuanced facets of their mentoring needs, ranging from substantive feedback, sponsorship, access to opportunities, professional development, emotional support, intellectual community, and many other domains. Finally, I think it's important to consider the broader view of mentoring and ask if there's ever a dark side to mentoring. So I end with a harrowing and popular fable of unconditional devotion, right? The giving tree. The giving tree teaches us that if we give away too much of ourselves, we may suffer. Yet many of the best mentors spend countless hours in meetings with students, respond to endless seas of emails, rarely reaching an inbox of 0, working outside of regular business hours or during sabbaticals and even parental leaves in order to be responsible to trainees, sometimes providing ad hoc quasi-psychotherapy to their students. This type of mentoring can tap personal and professional resources, often resulting in burnout or failure to fulfill other professional responsibilities and expectations. This is all the more complex when we know that these kinds of challenges are compounded for women and faculty of color. We recommend that these considerations be taken seriously and that clinical science consider enhancing infrastructure for mentors themselves, especially early career faculty, to help support them so that they can best guide the next generation of clinical scientists. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for thinking about how we can understand and better advance best research practices in mentoring clinical scientists.